Hi, I'm Flint Whitlock. I'm a volunteer here at the Broomfield Veterans Memorial Museum, and I wanted to introduce to you a new exhibit that we have at the museum now. It's called The Life and Times of Dwight David Eisenhower and the Colorado Connection. A lot of people know that Ike had some connection to Colorado, and I think the exhibit, which is going to be up in 3 parts, will pretty much detail everything that went on in terms of Ike and Colorado. We start with the early years. In this particular case, we talk about Ike's growing up in Abilene, Kansas, going to West Point. We have some West Point memorabilia here. There is a collection of photographs from West Point at 1915, which was the year that Ike graduated from West Point. We also have some items in the case here related to Mamie Dowd Eisenhower, who grew up in Denver and who married, eventually became President Eisenhower. So we have a little bit about her life in here as well. In this next section of the exhibit, we have a series of 5 posters that talk about the early part of Ike's life from 1890 to 1940. And we have some items here that talk about growing up in Abilene, Kansas, his cadetship at West Point. We go then to Eisenhower's meeting of Mamie and their house, Mamie's house in Denver. And we talk about the Eisenhower honeymoon, which was at the El Dorado Springs Resort west of Broomfield. We also have a number of items here from El Dorado Springs. The resort is no longer there, but the hot springs are, and they do bottle El Dorado Springs water for sale as well. So we have a number of items here that show what the resort looked like and what Ike and Mamie might have experienced there on their honeymoon. We go to an exhibit in the case here on Camp Colt. Eisenhower, as a captain, was the commandant of Camp Colt, which was a tank training center, and Ike was always hoping to get to France for combat in World War I, but the war ended before he had that chance. But we do have a number of items here that talk about what Camp Colt was like, and Eisenhower's role in the running of that camp. In 1919, there was a fairly large and interesting experiment that the Army conducted. They wanted to see if something happened. This was right after World War I had ended, and if the United States were ever invaded and our railroad system was disabled for a period of time, could military trucks travel cross-country? And so they scheduled a cross-country trip in the summer of 1919 and had a convoy of, I believe there were something like 88 vehicles that took part in this particular operation. And Eisenhower went along as an observer, and his job was to write a report after the convoy had concluded to prove whether or not the military had the capability of doing that. It was a rather strenuous event. A lot of trucks broke down, a lot of drivers had some problems too, running off the road and what have you. But this is a uniform here, a tunic and hat that would have been of the type worn by the soldiers on this particular convoy. So we have that mannequin there. After the convoy was completed, Eisenhower received orders to report to Fort Logan in southwest Denver. And so we have a poster here that talks about Eisenhower's stay at Fort Logan. We have a photograph of the officers' quarters where he and Mamie and their young son lived. Unfortunately, their first son, Dwight Eisenhower, died of scarlet fever at the age of 3. And this was a very traumatic event for the Eisenhowers. They had another son named John, who eventually became a brigadier general and a very well-known military historian. And then in the last 15 years of Eisenhower's timeline, you might say, of this exhibit from 1925 to 1940, we talk about all the things that he was involved in, the time that he spent in Panama with Fox Connor, who was a general who Eisenhower says was his mentor, and he learned more about what it was like to lead from Fox Connor than he did anywhere else. He happened to be the aide for General Douglas MacArthur, who was the Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s, and he went to the Philippines with MacArthur as well. He then returned to the States, and as war clouds were building over Europe, and he was involved as the executive officer of the 3rd Infantry Division stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. And this really prepares the groundwork for what he did in World War II. And there'll be 2 more exhibits after this one. The next one will be Eisenhower in the war years and how he masterminded and commanded 3 major invasions of North Africa and Sicily, and then became the Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe at Normandy. And then the third exhibit that we'll have will be on his post-war career. He was president of Columbia University for a while, and then became the presidential candidate for the Republican Party and was elected president and served 2 terms. This brings him back to Colorado. We're going to talk a lot about what happened once he became president and how Denver became the summer White House. And there are a lot of interesting connections. So you'll want to come back at least 2 more times to see the exhibit. And then finally, we have a video tablet here that has some highlights of Eisenhower's life and also the convoy that went cross country. And as you may know, hopefully, that the interstate highway system was something that Eisenhower championed and was begun under his administration. And we think that probably his coast-to-coast convoy in 1919 was the impetus that got the interstate highway system started. So that's about it for our forefather exhibit on Eisenhower, at least the first phase of it. And we hope you'll visit the museum and come back frequently to see the other parts of his life. Thank you very much.